List of concurrent current content.
Hello?
Hello? That would have been easier.
Let me mask. Can I start?
Hello? Where's
Where is Mr. Jonah? He's gone out again.
Here's everyone. Here's here.
Tracy, say moderator. You want to be
I'll be
introduced
introduced.
and called? Okay.
Can I start?
Otherwise, I think you should take yours. I think I have one of this. Can you give this to him? Hello?
He has one.
Okay. Hello? Oh, that's...
Peter, can I start? Are we on? Okay, come to me. Okay. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. On behalf of the Executive Director of IDEC, I would like to say a big thank you to all of us, those of us here in the auditorium, as well as our participants online. Thank you all for making time out of your busy schedule to join us for this all-important discussion. This webinar is a start of a series of forums or webinars that IDEC is going to have in the coming days, aimed at promoting peaceful elections with credible outcome for the December 7. For this first series, we are looking at using the virtual public space for the 2020 elections campaign, opportunities, challenges, and the way forward. This topic has become imperative given the current COVID context and the restrictions that has been imposed by the government. It is more likely that political parties' activities such as rallies, campaigns will be migrated online using the virtual public space. It is on this note that IDEC considers it necessary to have a conversation around the topic to promote freedom of speech and the media whilst ensuring responsible commentary and journalism. This is to avoid possible hate speech, disinformation, dirty propaganda, and the likes as we gear towards the 2020 elections. As we don't live in normal times, for those of us here in the auditorium, please be advised to adhere to all the necessary COVID protocol guidelines. On this note, I would like to welcome the moderator, Mr. Kwesi Jonah. He's a senior research fellow here at IDEC to take over the podium, and I wish all of us a fruitful discussion. Thank you.
It's double. It's double. Take this one off. Okay. Good morning, distinguished ladies and gentlemen, and a big welcome to all of you, wherever you are. Those of you in your offices, those of you at home, those of you here listening to us this morning. I am supposed to take over the podium, so I've taken it over right now. But my job, principal job to do now will be to introduce the distinguished panelists that we have assembled for this particular subject. But it is important for us to take note of this, that Ghana is one of several countries in the world that have had to conduct democratic elections under COVID-19 conditions, following the likes of South Korea. The US is also going to have elections. Mali has already done it. Burundi, and several other countries. In a multi-party democracy, parties and candidates in an election should communicate their election messages to the voting public. This calls for mass rallies, door-to-door campaigns, face-to-face interactions, all of which are prohibited under COVID-19 prevention protocols. Politicians seek power, first and foremost, to secure the safety of people and protect their livelihoods. The primary reason for the creation of the state is the security and the liberty of the individual. The danger of spreading the COVID-19 pandemic, which has already affected about 20,000 people and taken close to 150 lives in this country, is so real that we must take cognizance of it in the process of prosecuting our campaigns. We cannot continue to put the lives of our people at risk with the normal formats of political communication. We must now achieve the same campaign objectives using new and safer means of communicating our political messages to the voters. This means extensive use of the virtual media. Unfortunately, this is the particular form of media which is the least regulated in this country. Therefore, fake news, dirty propaganda, outright lies, insults can be spread without any danger of facing any sanctions. It is for this reason that IDEC has decided that if this is going to be the normal mode of campaigning, we better look at the problem of how to regulate it. We must find a way of squaring the circle. This is why we have met here this morning. And distinguished ladies and gentlemen, when we were conceptualizing this particular subject, we had to look around for the people who can help us to find answers to the burning questions facing us. And believe you me, we did our best and got the very best of panelists. First of all, I would like to introduce Mr. Kwame Benu, an IT innovations expert and founder of Pen Plus Bytes. Everybody in the civil society knows Pen Plus Bytes. I must thank him also because my initial contacts with him when we were organizing this program, very, very cordial. I mean, I thank you, Mr. Benu. But Mr. Kwame Benu, as I have already said, is the founder of W Pen Plus Bytes, a not-profit organization that promotes journalistic innovation and good governance across Africa through the effective use of information communication technologies. Under his leadership, the Institute established the African Elections Project, which seeks to enhance the ability of mainstream media and citizen journalists to harness the power of ICT technologies to provide timely, relevant, and impartial election coverage and analysis in African countries. He is a governing council member of the African University College of Communications Board, a member of the Media General, TV3, 3 News, and all the affiliates, as well as a Media General Digital Board Chair, one of the Ghana's foremost experts in information technology and democracy. Kwame has conducted numerous ICT trainings for African journalists and has written extensively on the political uses of information technology, as well as providing ICT consultancy services to numerous government and public sector organizations. Kwame is a Steve Biko and Foster Davis Fellow. He was co-chair of African Media Forum and the Geospatial Information Systems under the auspices of the United Nations Communication Commission for Africa, the UNECA. Kwame is a Reagan Fascal Democracy Fellow at the National Endowment for Democracy in Washington, D.C., and holds an MBA degree. He currently writes a column on technology and society for the Daily Graphic in Ghana. Kwame, you are welcome. The next panelist is my good friend, Mr. Suleimana Braiman, Media Foundation for West Africa. Mr. Suleimana is the Executive Director of the Media Foundation for West Africa, MFWA. He joined the organization in 2010 and later became the Deputy Executive Director, a position he held until his appointment as the Executive Director in January 2014. He is also the current Secretary General of the ECOWAS Civil Society Platform on Transparency and Accountability in Governance. There is an acronym, but please, I can't pronounce it. A member of the Executive Committee of the West African Civil Society Forum, WACSOF, a member of the Steering Committee of the African Network of Free Expression Organization, and a 2019 Eisenhower Global Fellow. From 2011 to 2015, he served on the 13-member Governing Council of IFEX, the global network of expression and organization based in Toronto, Canada. Suleimana previously worked for 5 years, 2002 to 2007, with the Chronicle newspaper as a reporter and later became the paper's news editor. In 2009, while studying at the University of Manitoba, Canada, he was a contributing writer on media and communication issues for Suit.com. He has been a reviewer of annual Global Press Freedom ratings, the Freedom of the Press Index, by the United States-based Freedom House Incorporated. He has participated and presented papers on media rights and freedom of expression issues at various national, regional, and international conferences. Suleimana holds an MPhil in Communication Studies and a bachelor's degree in Sociology with Philosophy, first-class honors from the University of Ghana. Mr. Suleimana, welcome. The last, but by no means the least, is my good friend, George Sapon, a friend from Legon Hall, University of Ghana, many, many years, and I don't want to start telling the stories here. But George is a lawyer and a journalist. He's the Executive Secretary of the National Media Commission and has more than 15 years professional experience in media, telecommunications, and health regulations. He is a regular speaker at major international forums on communications, policy, law, and regulation. He has taught in a number of institutions, including the University of Ghana, Legon, Accra Technical University, Ghana Institute of Journalism, and the School of Translators. George is a founding executive director of the Youth Network on Human Rights and Democracy, the Party Youth Forum, and the Young Leaders Program. George, you're welcome. You converse after this. And so, distinguished ladies and gentlemen, these are the distinguished panelists. And on this note, I would like to call my boss, Dr. Emmanuel Akwete, to give us the overview of this program. He likes a lot of applause. Please do it for him. I beg you.
Sorry, just before the executive director comes, I would like you to know that the program is live on our YouTube channel and also on our Facebook channel. And you can also live tweet with us on our Twitter. And the address is IDEG Ghana. IDEG Ghana. So on Twitter, you can just text at IDEG Ghana, IDEG Ghana. Thank you very much. Mr.
You can all tell I'm a very shy person, so accolades and applauses are not things I'm used to. Thank you very much. I'm particularly delighted we have the best of panelists we could get for the subject. And we are happy because we think this discussion might elevate the conversations and the possibilities that we have to make sure that whether there's COVID or no COVID, we are able to have peaceful elections with credible outcomes in this year. The elections are 5 months away, practically, and it is the shortest time we have to prepare for elections that, from all indications, are going to be highly competitive. And yet, one of the risks we are dealing with, but one that probably is a knockouter, is COVID-19. We have other risks in our elections. You know that before COVID silenced and sobered us and confined us a little bit, we were very concerned about the risk of armed vigilantes playing inordinate roles in our elections and what violence that could lead to. And that became a very major thing, given what had transpired in 2019, the by-election, also West Wuogon, and all that. So, but COVID puts a different spin on the whole situation. And you would also recall that because of COVID and the restrictions and other things that it brought, there was a time we thought elections would not be held. There was a discussion, very lively discussion, in the month of April, thereabout, whether these elections would be postponed, suspended, or whatever. But we know for certain it is coming on. We've also known that battles had to be fought because of elections. There were those who said, because of COVID-19, there were those who said that, look, the risk of infection could be so high that we shouldn't gather. The public space became the critical harvesting arena for COVID. As we come, we gather. Anytime there's gathering in anywhere, as we've seen in the US, those who defied and went to have a beach party in Florida, in Texas, and so they are all in some very serious situations now, and so on. But that is where it attacks. And if you look at Ghanaians, everything we do is public. Even in the confined rooms is public, because when people come, there's a touchy feeling, there is Charlie is saying and all that, people are hugging and so on, at the funerals, at the weddings, at the birthday parties and all that. So it was such a great challenge. And as we observed, we saw that, wow, those who were concerned about how we could organize the elections and avoid COVID hitting us probably had a point, in the sense that our elections are energetic. The campaigns start early. We do not have strict election season, and so it starts, and people like the Choboi, and they like the rallies, and they like the big meetings, whether they are primaries for parliamentary elections or meeting in halls and all that. So when you put the question then is that if our spaces are shut, how can we do elections the way we know it? And what options are there? In here, we felt very strongly that COVID also had some positive aspects, not in terms of the risk of health and death, but it also made us reflect a bit more and see what more we have that we could use to ensure that we have good elections peaceful with credible outcomes, as we call it in IDE. So it was our thoughts about why we should not yield to the temptation, and particularly the president, the pressure on him to lift up the restrictions, so ID cards and registration of voters will go on, whether it's a brand new register which requires general registration, and up to over 15 million people having to come out to register to exhibit and vote and so on, as against a limited number, whether using existing register and all that. But all that is history now. We're involved in the process of registering, compiling a new register for elections 5 months away. And we are beginning to see that there's an aspect of our management of COVID-19 that we hadn't paid great attention to. The behavior of people at the polling stations, everybody said, wow, the education didn't go far. But we forgot, and this is a very important point that I wish to emphasize, we forgot that because of COVID and the attempt to deal with COVID, a different situation had been created by the enactment of the Imposition of Restrictions Act 2012. It's a new law under which, like, the president governs like under an emergency. He can make laws under emergency, and the usual scrutiny, debate, processes and so on could all be collapsed into a few days, and the law is there and so on. So many of them have taken place, but education about these laws and what they mean for our elections, what they mean for campaigning and so on, is almost zero. We all take it that the only thing we do in COVID is to socially distance, observe the hygiene protocols. Maybe lockdowns would occur. We are not going to church in the huge numbers. Only 100 people could assemble. And public gathering generally is prohibited on a large scale. And a friend of mine, two professors who have looked at this, says this is what they say. The Imposition of Restrictions Act have actually constrained a number of freedoms that are vital to elections and vital to us enjoying our democratic rights. The freedom of expression. You can speak by heart, you can threaten, you can... Now you know that it's a very important way of us being able... freedom of assembly, association, we can meet anywhere and we can talk. Now we can't. Even the church has a number attached to it and all that. And when we went into lockdown, it was more serious. Freedom of information, freedom of movement, freedom of association, I've mentioned that, and freedom from intimidation. So for instance, the police are saying that, hey, under the executive instrument, I haven't chewed the number, but if you don't put on your face mask in your car, you're committing an offense. And you have to find 60,000 Ghana cedis to pay, and so on. And I've heard Ghana Bar Associations and others pleading. But we felt that we failed to really put the Imposition of Restrictions Act in the election context, in the electioneering, and see what does it really mean. Because you see, in elections, all our rights, all our human rights come into play. we want to speak, we want to gather, but we're also demanding for economic well-being, and socially we are complaining, we are holding our governments accountable, radio, everybody's busy, and so on. But what does it mean? How do we still go on with this activity? Because nobody wanted our elections postponed because of its implications to our democracy, our political stability, and the governance, democratic governance. If anything, we want to tell COVID-19, whether it comes or not, our democracy is stable and resilient. So we need to find a way of doing that. And the more we looked at how this could be done, we realized that, although the physical space is closed and restricted, it's free-flowing on media, whether it's radio, where a majority of our people listen and get their news, FM radio stations, or whether it's social media, the vibrant, educated youth, play there, and YouTube, of course, everybody, whether you're educated or not, you still. So the public political space, or the public space for elections, for discussing manifestos, for telling our leaders about our problems and holding them accountable to the promises they didn't deliver, and so on, apparently and obviously could take place and has been taking place in another sphere, a virtual sphere aided by technology. So we asked ourselves, based on my privileged relationship with the Executive Secretary of the National Media Commission, since 2008, we are always talking about what is happening in elections in the media. They do have some data that shows that a lot happens on radio that a lot of us are also not aware of. And then I've seen Suleimana's work on just tracking, monitoring, the language. In 2016, more about bad language. Now I think misinformation and the facts are not correct. He's doing that. I think he's bringing it all together. So all this work are being done, but it never assumed greater importance as it is in the COVID context. And we thought we should raise awareness that there is a sphere that we still could use, but some things happen there that are frightening. I know that hate speech was so rife in December 2008 when we had to go for the second round. It was not a joke. NMC in various conversations had made that clear, that throughout the country. And then I know that Kwame, in his writing, has always pointed out that, look, radio and so on, you have a whole lot. I can see Atinkan and Inshira. Masa, I don't know the others, but the names are many. And we are also told that the ownership itself is part of the polarizing game. Two parties and so on. So it's gone into the media sphere. So I think when you put it all together, it is not our behavior that threatens democracy per se, but it is the spaces in which we can articulate. COVID had come, and then media spaces that probably are so liberal but also owned politically. So what does it mean to campaigning if now people want to do their campaigning, educate people on radio, on TV, on digital stations, and what is the preponderance of programs, what is their thrust, and so on. How do we open the spaces up and educate people so they can sit by their radio to hear some campaign going on, because the candidates could sit in a panel discussion and tell them exactly what they are going to do. How do they feedback, and how do they critically look at what really would work for us in the exercise of our mandate, so that they become more informed voters. So as we looked at all this, it became clear to us that it would take a conversation by these three giants in the area that we think has become the new, the virtual public space. And this is the first time it is the predominant space for our elections. So I wouldn't take much time. We're going to listen to them. I just hope that at the end of the day, they would go beyond this to also articulate some of the things. Probably if we can get a simple guide to help us know how to monitor the stations, probably report on misinformation and things that are threatening democracy, or the even playing field that everybody must have, whether some radio stations say you can't go and so on. But as citizens, we observe and we inform authorities and we form the experts to see what can be done, so that at the end of the day we could say, yes, there was COVID-19, but our elections went on very well, and all those fears were laid because we got people who told us what to look for, what to be vigilant about, what to report, so that the authorities would intervene. My last point, however, is that you recall that in 2015, 2016, just about this time or earlier, the police were extremely concerned about social media, and they were also concerned about vigilantes. 4 years on, we have the same risks, probably at a higher level, intensified, and so on. And this time, we don't know what the police will do. At least in 2016, they threatened shutting down social media. It was a very serious thing. It got the international community to get involved and all that. But the same international community now looks more at COVID. And it really is not so clear about how to intervene. For example, the observers that are sent into countries holding elections like Ghana, this year alone, there are about 20 African countries, or 23, doing elections. Now, most of them are not coming. I don't know the situation in December, but if you look at what I term the resurgence of COVID-19, you're going to see a situation that many would not come. Our airports are still closed. So what they used to monitor and also report is not happening the way, on the scale it used to. And whether they will come and observe our elections, we don't know. AU, ECOWAS missions, they are all out now. So a lot depends on us, and a lot depends on few people with the knowledge of what is at risk and what we need to do. And we hope we can lead in that, in bringing about a public education that goes beyond social distancing, but also makes elections and the rights of the people and how to behave in this challenging context possible, so that at the end of the day we would feel that, yes, we are democracy triumphed and Ghanaians delivered what they did in 2016 and on, in terms of peaceful and credible, peaceful elections with credible results. So I'm delighted. I have a lot to learn, and I hope you all would see this as a beginning of programs that we'll be doing. As the lady who introduced the program said, this is the first of activities we are organizing ourselves. Otherwise, we've been speaking on other webinars for others, but now we also would look at the critical strategic things that we can bring up and bring our experts who would help us think through, so that we'll have the right conditions to ensure peaceful elections with credible outcomes come December. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Kwete. Let us give us another. He likes it. Okay. So, with the address by Dr. Akwete, it is now my humble duty to call upon Mr. Kwame Anhebenu, the IT tech expert and founder of Pen Plus Bytes, to address us on the topic, the virtual media space in Ghana's emerging democracy, the risks and the opportunities. Kwame, you're welcome.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. To turn this one off. Good morning once again. Thanks very much for inviting me. This is my first time in this wonderful house, so I'm very privileged to be here. I'm trying to pull out the slides. Not sure how it's organized here. So basically, I'm going to look at it's up now. So I'm going to look at digital technology and how it's going to impact on our elections within the context of our global pandemic that we are going through. Yeah. So I'll look at the introduction, look at some tech applications in elections. Of course, we have a lot of challenges. Look at some solutions, and more importantly, come out with some recommendations that can be useful in trying to resolve some of these issues that we're experiencing. New digital technologies are very indispensable in our space today, largely because, I'm not sure I'm speaking to the slides sequentially. I want the first slides. Sequence, yeah, okay. So we're in the period of this global pandemic, and it's having significant changes across every aspect of our lives. We're looking at wearing all this fancy face masks and those masks, and people decide to wear them in a very interesting manner as well. And democracy, as we know, is being tested, largely because a lot of countries, and Dr. Akwete mentioned that some are holding elections, some are postponing them and all that. But the wonderful news is that technology is helping in resolving some of these challenges that we're experiencing in the space. However, it comes with challenges. Now, new digital technologies is now indispensable for conduct of better elections. So the electoral management bodies are doing so, the political parties are using it. Across board, any elections that is held in the world today, we have technology at the center. However, with this pandemic, where we mentioned that we should not have, our still is physical distancing, not social distancing, it means that technology is now going to be at the center of all this, because the opportunities to go to the rallies and shout and scream and get excited are all going to be out of the picture. However, how do we police this space? How do we control? How do we regulate? The virtual electoral space becomes a very big issue. Now, we need to situate this within the context of the broader use of technology across our whole society. I have a pointer, so that will help, yeah? It's not working though, is it? Okay, I'm not sure. It's not working, so can you go on here? Okay, so I'm now going to look at the virtual space. What is the virtual space that we are now going to have a lot of political activities happening? Let me go. Let's scroll from here. Let's talk about technology. Yeah? So I want to paint the picture. If you look at the global picture now, we have close to 7.75 billion persons, right, as the global population. And out of that population, we have 67% relying on the use of what? Mobile telephony. Now, 59% also use what? The internet. Then in terms of social media, we have 49%. So this is the virtual space we are talking about if you look at the global picture. Now moving on. Now, look, let's take Ghana. Our current population stands at 30 million plus, and out of that population, we have a unique statistics, 130% of unique mobile devices in the country. That means a lot of people have more than one connection to mobile telephony. In terms of internet, our statistics stand at 48%. Then it drops to 20% when we come to social media. So if we are reflecting on the use of technology in elections and all that, we have to look at the context, and the statistics point to which areas we are referring to. And it's quite clear from this statistics that mobile telephony is the key. It's going to be the core place that will drive the use of technology in the electoral space. Now here, these are data from the most visited website in Ghana. The data is 2020 January. And you can see that search from Google is the top. Then we have Ghana Web, which is number 3, for example. We have Peace FM Online. And in this space, we don't have any political website or government website related to the statistics. We have My Join Online as well. So it's called to question, in terms of independent website related to political discourse, are they visited or not, become a question that we want to pose ourselves. Now, let's look at social media, because social media stands at the center of a lot of this discussion. Currently, we have 6 million active social media users in the country, and out of that population, it refers to 20% of our population. Is a 20% sufficient? And in politics, they tell you every number is critical, so 20% is key, and we have to look at it. Now, in terms of change, there is a recorded increase in 12%, and we are talking January, and based on all going, I think this data will have gone up more in terms of how people are relying on technology in terms of social media. Now, most of people who access social media tend to do that using mobile telephony. So again, mobile is the center of all the discussion when it comes to our virtual space in Ghana today. And the numbers show 88%. Now let's look at spending power on social media and the profile. Now you can see that, I don't know the age group here, but this shows that a lot of the demographic points to 18 to 24. Then we have 25 to 34. Now this drop when you cross the 35 to 44 age bracket, it drops to 3.9. So you can see that in terms of the demographics, it's quite youthful in the terms of the people that are consuming social media. And any strategy or any look at the space have to be looked at in the context of the statistics. Now, what is the most used social media platform in Ghana today? Your guess is good as mine. It's WhatsApp. So WhatsApp is at the middle of all the usage, and it's commanding 82% of that. And that's closely followed by Facebook. So between WhatsApp and Facebook, you can describe how social media ecosystem is depicted in Ghana today. Now, I hope the statistics have painted where we are. Now, let's look at history. We can consider 2004 as the baseline for the use of technology in elections in a more radical manner. And at that point in time, it was SMS. And you saw a lot of use of SMS. The Electoral Commissioner at that time gave the political parties, for the first time, the voter roll on a CD-ROM, instead of printing it out and all that. So you saw a lot of activities, and the political parties also were trying to tabulate the results coming in. Now, for each election since then, we see growth in the use of technology in elections. Political parties, the Electoral Management Board, civil society, media, citizens across board, the international observers, as Dr. Kwete mentioned, all rely on the use of technology. And the prediction was that 2020 was going to see a lot of applications. And now with this pandemic, it's totally indispensable in our electoral discourse now. Now, some points on what the current voter registration. Now, for me, it's quite disappointing that it's happening. And more importantly also, the Electoral Commission is not taking advantage of technology. Today, it's possible to do this registration end to end, even considering what biometric and facial recognition features that we're talking about sitting at home with the technology that we have. There could be legal issues and all that, maybe there's a separate point to that, but it's possible and it can be done to create safe environment for people to vote, go and register. In the absence of that, I was hoping to see that we should have done a lot more use of technology in terms of how we control the crowd at the polling stations, when the registration center, how the EC communicates with citizens. So for example, if you ask me, where's the nearest registration center around this area, the use of technology can answer those questions for me in a more one-to-one manner. Again, from where I stand, maybe Sule will confirm that civil society artists are not pushing this voter registration process using technology. Maybe because some of them believe that, look, it should not happen. But you are not seeing the push enough in terms of getting people to go out to vote, register. Largely because there's health implication when some people go out, so there is an issue there. And I think technology can play a role. Again, we are seeing political parties using this technology, especially WhatsApp and social media, to encourage their base to go out and register. So they do that by sending out visualization, encouraging their members to use their pictures to tell people to go out to vote, register. So we see a lot of that happening. Now, let's look at, I have to go back. Let's look at what is happening today in terms of elections. The power of internet and social media as a tool for political mobilization is established. So we are seeing a lot of the political parties using it to communicate with voters, especially on WhatsApp. Fundraising, they're using mobile money, for example. There are virtual events, town hall, campaign rallies, using some of these technologies. Door-to-door is happening in terms of messaging, especially on WhatsApp. Then I'll call the serial callers. They are giving way to what I call digital foot soldiers. So you have the political parties actually organize the manner that they have digital foot soldiers. Some of these foot soldiers may attack some people who they consider not to be aligned to their interests on social media in an aggressive manner. Some of them are doing a good job, but they not exist. Now, if you monitor elections in this country, at every election times, you see a lot of newspapers on the newsstand. So newspapers that are born today just for the elections, after the election go away. But this time, they are being replaced by news websites aligned to political parties. So we recorded close to about 100 websites all coming up on stream just as part of this build-up to the elections. Some of them doing all the bad things you can think of, but they are aligned to some of the political parties. The challenge with some of these news websites is that you cannot actually know who is behind it, and that's a big issue. However, it's important to know that in Ghana today, traditional media, that's radio and TV, is still huge. So in that direction, what we are seeing is that most of the political parties are using what we call all media strategy, which combine the traditional media with social media and the digital platforms. Yes. Now, in terms of how this is manifested, social media, in terms of WhatsApp, is the key tool. The political parties are using the law. They use it for community management, getting their messages out to their base and all that. So social media remains the top of the tool that political parties are using. We're seeing a lot of visualization. So, for example, the prospective candidate will go and donate marks or verified bucket to some constituents, and they will visualize it to tell the story. So we're seeing a lot of visualizations. Then short videos are also in the space where they have some message in a short video, which is distributed through WhatsApp and Facebook as well. There is a lot of interactive sessions, and I think the former president is doing that. He has his Facebook Live. Then we are also seeing micro-targeting of voters, where based on some algorithm, when you go on Facebook, you're able to tell that, look, this group of people are aligned to what my political interest, then can direct adverts to them. There again, there is a lot of political misinformation and election time disinformation, so that is also happening. And political parties or some candidates are going out there to create some of this content, and it's part of it. Now, what is missing in the space is that we are not seeing a lot of the use of artificial intelligence in Ghana, for example. The use of data science and persuasive science is also not happening the way it should happen. I think it's going to happen. Personalize and target ad to voters is also not happening in a way that and also a targeting of for prospective voters. Now, challenges. The current regulatory framework is just not up to task. Are you okay? It was not designed to deal with digital platforms. So the rules that Mr. Sapon want to push just don't work in this space, the manner they should work. So any formal regulation of social media, of online space is very complex. I will not stand here and just say that, look, it's easy. Largely because the internet is premised on openness, and it lacks a central control. And based on that, if you want to introduce any element of control or regulation, is problematic. Then you have to trade off. Once you start doing regulation, censorship will come in, freedom of speech may be eroded. So how do you balance that? Become one of the key issues on the table when you're discussing the issue. One way of doing regulation is that you have to define inappropriate content. Now, somebody will tell you that sex education is pornographic content. Somebody will believe that sex education is not pornographic content. So how do we define inappropriate content? I'm not saying that inappropriate content cannot be defined. It can be defined, but sometimes there are gray areas, and that's where challenges come. Given this background, it's very difficult to maintain public order in these virtual spaces. Yeah. One issue is that cross-border regulations become problematic, largely because I can run a website, the server may be in Nigeria, my office may be UK, my domain may be registered in in US. So trying to regulate have some fundamental issues because of the fact that this situation is not linked to a particular country. Implementation of some of this regulation, because it's linked to technology, is very expensive. The opportunity cost could be a hospital. So do you want us to not build a hospital to regulate the space becomes an issue. Misinformation, disinformation, fake news can spread faster. They have stronger legs when it comes to this space than any other space. There's also a lot of mistrust in political communication, because people are not saying that, look, if this information comes out, is it fake? And largely due to that, that mistrust does not help in our political communication. There is also data protection and privacy issues. The data that a lot of these social media or online companies are collecting, how is it protected, and how do we ensure that it does not end up in the wrong hands? The mobile, I think recently there was the issue about Vodafone releasing some of personal data as part of all those issues come to play in terms of how do you ensure regulation, because the data is quite important in the hands of anybody, can be used for a lot of things. Now, we also experience inequalities. Not all of us are technological savvy. And it means that participation becomes problematic. Connectivity is an issue. Cost. When you send people videos, they'll be asking, oh, what's this video about? Because once they download it, it goes into their data, it reduces it, and it means that they have to spend more money on data. Also, political artists using the space are not investing in it a lot, so you see them cutting corners, and this leads to some of the challenges we experience when we come to in terms of how the structure is organized. And also, in the political parties, the well-established one, obviously, will have more resources to do this better than the newbies on the block. Okay. So now, what are the options? Yeah, on top of the food chain is China. what has China done? China has done what we have the Great Firewall, which is basically laws and technologies to regulate the internet. And they do so by ensuring that when you go to China, you cannot use WhatsApp because they block it. Are you okay? So they have Chinese versions of what? All those what? Services. And what that means is that they have better control. Also, one of the ways we teach, Dr. Akwesi mentioned that the IGP was going to ban what, social media, is to use what we call virtual private networks to bypass such a ban. But in China also, the VPN have been blocked. So we can say that these guys are absolutely serious on how they are controlling the whole internet. There is a cyberspace administration of China, and their mandate is to monitor. So they do a better work of monitoring than Suleiman. And any offending website is closed down, a mobile app is pulled down. That's what they do. And they have hundreds and thousands of cyber police. So these guys wake up, and their work they are doing is that they are doing work solely online, policing the internet. They monitor social media, they stream messages using censored words. So they have a list of words. When you say democracy, for example, your message will not go through. When you talk about freedom of speech, it will not go through. So when we look at regulation, this represents the top and the ultimate. However, as you can agree with me, it means what? Freedom of speech is what? Thrown out. So the better you can regulate this, you have degrading of freedom of speech and all that. So this is. So in between that, what can we do? Self-governance camp. And self-governance, I'm starting with the social media companies. Here, the focus is that they will have a set of terms and conditions, guidelines, and sometimes laws and regulation in the country to govern the content they consider inappropriate and remove such a content. Such inappropriate content could be illegal content. Revenge porn is one of them. Extremist material, hate speech, fake news, violence, bullying, child abuse, and so on and so forth. So these companies, based on their rules, will not allow you to post this content. When these contents go up, they either remove it or they label it. So the detection and the removal process is either done by automation, so they have algorithms to do that, or they have humans be doing that. But however, self-governance is just scratching the surface, because the issue is quite huge. Now, Facebook approach. In comparison to Twitter, Facebook for a long time was saying that, look, we have created a space. You can post all you want. We will not try to regulate. We will not try to control. Facebook is important because if you refer to the statistics I pointed out, they are the biggest in the world. And remember, Facebook is also the owner of WhatsApp. So it tells you how big that company is. However, there is a debate about what do you do in this space. If you're following the debate in the US, they have the Stop Hate for Profit, where companies are saying that, look, we're not going to advertise on Facebook again because of the way they are treating content, which they consider inappropriate online. And that meant that Facebook lost about 8% of its market value, which is running into 56 billion US dollars. The founder of Facebook lost about $7 billion. So based on that, they are thinking about doing some changes in terms of labeling content, in terms of ensuring that we can remove some content. Can you move to the next slide, please? So in this sense, President Trump, are you okay if you're following the debate, posted some content, and they are now trying to label them and trying to block ads coming from some element. Twitter for a long time have been doing this type of self-governance or regulation. Now the bad example was that when President Donald Trump did not like how the Twitter, for example, was labeling and removing its content, he signed executive order to limit some broad protection enjoyed by these companies. And this is not the example that we should copy, but it happened here. And that said, political artists, especially political parties, also should consider what self-governance very seriously. Now, learning from the pandemic, currently, the social media companies are very strict on this. When you post anything, like even a colleague was trying to sell what face masks on Facebook, they asked her to what, take it off because of issues surrounding some of this fake content. So they're using WHO data to what, guide them in what, doing this what, regulation. So the question is that, can we do the same for what, political discourse? Here we use the electoral management body, civil society, artists, trusted media houses as a basis to supply that data which was being supplied by WHO in this context of the pandemic. Now, I have here a long list of various countries and their regulatory framework guiding the policing or trying to regulate social media. Now, I have an interesting chart here, trying to look at level of difficulty in terms of how to regulate the space. The first level, which are considered the base, which is very difficult, is that we have weaponization of what, information. We have foreign entities. An example is Russia trying to what, influence elections in what, USA. We have cross-border activities. And that space is very what, difficult to regulate because it's not so visible. And you have a lot of issues surrounding it. The other aspect is for data abuse, which happened in the case of Cambridge Analytica, where data of what Facebook users were taken and used. And when these things happen, some people look at the fact, oh, regulators, are they asleep? But the question is that, no, they are not. Because things are happening so fast that regulation is not able to what, keep pace with it. Again, messaging services, WhatsApp is quite also problematic because most of these WhatsApp messages happen in spaces where you cannot have access to. There is also the social media, the independent news websites I mentioned, and also traditional what, media. I have here some solutions, but I'll run through them quickly to the next one. Let's go. So globally, 2020 is going to see a lot of significant usage of what online campaign tools. We established that. And Ghana is going to be part and parcel of it. This increase in terms of data information linked to elections and political discourse have challenges in terms of what, control and regulations. And we have to understand that, I cannot speak to that, that it's going to have some impact on the democracy that we know it. And it's called for more research and more insight into how the space is going to pan out. So in conclusion, the recommendation that when it comes to regulations and standards, let's set what, basic what, principles. Are you okay? That guided, so we have some flexibility. Instead of just going straight to have concrete laws, institutions and all that, it should grow what, organically, rather than starting from a point of a first position. Self-governance and regulations are not performing well enough. So largely because social media was not created to aid democracy. Are you okay? It's a tool to harvest what? You and I are data, so they can sell it and make money. That's how they created it. We are not trying to use this for something else. And it means that there are issues related to that. Facebook, for example, had this, their Supreme Court for content moderation, but we are yet to see how that is going to pan out. Again, internet and social media shutdowns is always considered, and we have to make sure that we don't allow that to be put on the table. And discussions such as what we're having today can provide some options or solutions that will avoid those shutdowns. But the point is that if we don't, the shutdown is always on the table. And we should not kid ourselves that it cannot be introduced, especially in the space that we have the president with a lot of what, abilities to what, create a lot of restrictions. We also have to know that social media was not designed as a serious tool. It's something that was designed to be a silly tool to provide social connectivity. And that's the basis of it. And trying to use it for serious work have some more challenges that we need to understand that context. And again, if you're going to have any law, policies, or any regulation, we have to ensure that we protect what, the freedom of both expression and speech. Now, my recommendations. So this to Dr. Akwete especially, you know, he like organizing forums for political parties to sign that have a very good behavior. So this time, I'm calling on you to organize one for the political party to sign up that law. When it comes to the use of what? Social media, online spaces, they should what? Put on their best of behavior. So we need to what? Have some pledge of a sort for them to what? Say, sign up to that law. We are hopefully going to what? Respect them. So that's the first recommendation I want to make. We need to mount campaigns that freedom of speech is very critical. In light of any regulations or any law, we need to make sure that we look at freedom of what? Speech. Now, to the regulatory agencies, they need to investigate and look at how they can what? Provide some order in the space. However, they should do this in what? Through what? Public what? Discourse. So the public is what? Brought along in this what? Discussions. The Electoral Commission also can have some policy in terms of zero tolerance for inappropriate behavior by the candidates and political parties. I don't know how the law will allow them to do so, but they can do so. Now, the regulatory agencies have to collaborate. So we have the National Media Commission, the National Communication Authority, the Data Protection Commission, the National Cyber Security Center. The base is so big that one agency cannot deal with it. So effective regulation can only happen through what? Collaboration. Next one. Now, donors here, we always have to rely on them. We need resources for research because a lot of these issues in our context, we still don't have proper data and insight. And I believe in policy making, the better evidence you have, the better your outcome. So I think it's very critical that we ensure that we can have resources that allow us, and that also include our research institutions and universities, that we need to learn more about this space. Now, the political parties should not be left on their own. We need to find resources for them to what? Build their capacity, build their institutional framework to allow them to take part in this what? Space effectively. I think George was telling us about the work they did when they were student leaders and all that. Most of these guys know the traditional way, and we cannot assume that they will know the new ways of doing so without giving them the push or support. So it's very important that we can have that in mind when we try to look at this. Citizens have to provide input to the debate. They can also report on incidents of abuse, because the Ghana Police Service, for example, is not visible on social media or online. And it's only citizens that can see some of these issues and they report, and we can deal with it. Largely due to the fact that in the law says that if there is a crime, you have to go to a physical police station to go and report. So some of this issue, the guys they're playing on social media will not leave their homes and go to a police station. So we have to look at ways to create channels for giving us feedback on some of these abuses that may occur. Political parties, they need to invest in a system, the technology to enable them to take full advantage of the new digital technologies. Self-regulation, so we're asking them to be good boys and girls. It's very important, they have to separate. They need to make sure that their virtual strategies are inclusive, largely because not everybody is in a space now. So if you try to do more tech, you may leave out people who cannot participate. The government, of course, is going to be policies and laws, and the key issue is that no matter what they do, we have to ensure that the freedom of speech is guaranteed and protected at all costs, and we have to. The government also have to maintain proactive relationship with social media companies, Facebook and all that, because anything that happens in the space, these companies, their turnover is bigger than our GDP, and they are powerful. So we need to, if you want to regulate, can have all the nice laws and all that, but if you don't have a relationship with them, it may not work out well. Again, we need to encourage the government to invest in mass digital and information literacy for all citizens from infancy. We have to push that. We have to push the fact that, look, we need digital literacy, information literacy and all that, because that's one of the surest way of trying to fight fake news and disinformation. The media have to work towards setting good examples as they distribute content, as well as doing their traditional role of providing education and information. The media have to hold political parties to what account in terms of the fact that if they see some behaviors of on social media or online which is inappropriate, they have to call those political parties to what order. So they have a key role to what play. Again, the media also have to do what self-regulation. So on that note, I want to say thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Suleiman. Another one, round of applause for him, please. Yeah. So it is now the turn of Mr. Suleiman Breman, Media Foundation for West Africa. Mr. Suleiman, welcome.
Thank you very much. After listening to that wonderful presentation by Kwame, as I was sitting, I was reflecting, and what came to mind was perhaps I should attempt to do, even though I'm not a lawyer, what lawyers would normally do by simply saying, I have nothing more useful to add. But given that I'm not a lawyer, I will try to have something to add. I think Kwame's presentation really sets the tone for us, and talking about the digital or virtual space, I think he's really given us a context of the landscape and what it is now, the implications and all of that. So perhaps I would shift from what I had intended in terms of touching on the digital realm and focus more on perhaps what I would call the traditional virtual space. As Kwame did indicate, even though digital platforms are growing, and in fact, when I did check Internet World Stats, as of yesterday, the figures they put there in terms of our penetration, they put internet penetration around somewhere 15 million people, and for Facebook, for example, around 7.3 million. So from the end of 2019 figures that Kwame graciously shared, I think the figures continue to grow, and that certainly demonstrates the fact that the digital space is becoming an important arena for all of us. So I would want to focus on the traditional virtual space, which I think is still going to play a critical role, radio in particular. And as you know, across the country now, wherever you go, I think in almost every district now, there is at least one FM station. Whether it is in Nandom, where you have Radio Freed, or you go to Garu, where you have quality radio, or you go to Enchi, where you have Tricky FM, or you go to, Kumasi, where you have Oyerepa FM. I think some of the names are now even becoming quite funny, and we know all of them. You know, sometimes people call and say, "This is Oyerepa FM," and I'm like, "Is it really an FM station?" They say, "Oh yeah. We just came up not too long ago." So across the country, everywhere, you would find an FM station, which is great. Now, these FM stations, you can say they are quite diverse, whether you're talking about linguistic, so you can find. So if you go to Garu, Quality FM is broadcasting in Kusal. If you go to Nandom, Radio Freed is broadcasting in Dagari and Sisali. If you go to Enchi, Tricky FM is broadcasting in Sefi and partly Chi, and so on and so forth. If you come here in Accra, you would find Obonu FM broadcasting in Ghana. If you go to Tamale, you would find ZAR Radio broadcasting in Dagbani. You would find Simli Radio doing the same. You find Gaki Radio in Saboba, doing the local language broadcast. So in terms of diversity, linguistic diversity, that is great. There's also diversity in terms of the types of ownership. So you would find community radio stations, you would find commercial radio stations, private, you would find institutional radio stations, Radio Universe, ATL FM, and so on and so forth. You would find, of course, the state broadcaster. You would find foreign-owned media organizations like BBC, FM station here, or VOA, or Radio France International. So in terms of who owns the diversity, I think that it is also a great thing that we have. Then, of course, if you take the portals, as Kwame was saying, you would also find diversity in terms of who owns what and so on and so forth, even though a lot of tricks is happening there, and at some point I would come to that. So if you're talking about the numbers, almost 400 radio stations broadcasting to a population of about 30 million, and even the 30 million, we have maybe those under 5 or those under 10. If you take them out, we are talking about maybe 26 million people. So it's one of the most densely or one of the most saturated media environments you can find around the world, which, you know, ideally should be good for our democracy. So numbers are good. Diversity linguistically is good. Diversity in terms of ownership is good. So pluralism and diversity are all fine. And these, for me, are ordinarily the features that you would want to expect in a media landscape that should support a vibrant, pluralistic democracy, and during election, the kind of media environment that should ordinarily support issues-based campaigning and so on and so forth. But there are the real issues of the nuances that come in terms of whether the ecosystem we have, that we can finally talk about it as is plural, is diverse, is located in different places, communicating in different languages, and so on and so forth, really gives us what we want. Now, this will lead us to, yes, there's diversity in terms of ownership. So private, commercial, state, community, institutional, if you look at them that way, yes, there's diversity. But is there diversity in terms of the individuals who own these media organizations? And that, for me, is one of the critical issues that we need to look at. About almost 90% of these media organizations spread across the country are owned by Ghanaians, of course, but these are partisan individuals. So whether you are talking about Wuntumi FM or Wuntumi TV in Kumasi, or you are talking about Power FM or Ahoto FM in Accra, or you are talking about Oman FM or Ash FM, or you are talking about Might FM in Savelugu, or you are talking about Source FM in Boku. These are media organizations that have been set up by partisan individuals. Well, somebody would say, but what is the problem? The problem is, in most instances, these people set up these media houses not for the business of journalism, but for the business of political propaganda. And I will give an example. In 2016, when we're doing the monitoring, the campaign language monitoring, in the Ashanti region, the station that was recording a lot of infractions was Ash FM. And we know Ash FM is owned by Honorable Ken Ejapon. So we deployed a team of highly respected people, people that I thought, well, any person running a media house would defer to. And these people included the then chairman of the National Media Commission, Nana Kwesi Janapintin, a member of the commission, Dr. Doris Dati, one of our respected media personalities, Ajoy Ebo Afari, who then was the chairperson of the Editors Forum Ghana, my former boss, Professor Kwame Kakari, and the current DG of Ghana Broadcasting Corporation, who was then head of the communications department at UDS, Professor Amin Al-Hassan. And the mission was to go and have a conversation with these managers of Ash FM to let them appreciate the fact that, look, you can do what you are doing without the insults, without the abuses, without the unsubstantiated allegations, and so on and so forth. So we traveled to Kumasi. Then we met with the manager and the team. And I would say that right from the beginning, the reception was quite hostile. Of course, we're coming from Media Foundation that has always projected them as one of the stations that records high number of incidents. And the conclusion of the meeting was that, well, look, we are set up and we would focus on what we are doing. Our business or our interest is making sure that, you know, our party comes to power. So really, it's not about all that you are talking to us about. We know these things about ethics and that and that and that, but, you know, and because of what we do, we also have the listeners. And once we have the listeners, businesses are advertising with us. So what is this point about, you know, be ethical, be decent, be that, and so on and so forth. And it is not just Ash FM. There are a number of other stations that, you know, you go and at the end of the conversation, you get the same impression that, look, this media organization is not about the business of journalism, it's not about your ethics, and so on and so forth. So if you have an environment where close to 90% of these media organizations are owned by partisan individuals, and in fact last week, we just released our first report on the campaign language monitoring. And the top two stations, Oman FM and Power FM. And we know that these are stations belonging to the NDC or pro-NDC, pro-NPP. Only yesterday, we released another report which monitors, you know, ethical compliance among media organizations. Again, these same two media organizations were found to be on top, in a comfortable lead indeed, in terms of the number of ethical violations that they are breaching, Power FM, Oman FM. So the ownership is really a major issue when it comes to the role of the media in the electoral cycle. In fact, the other thing that I experienced in 2016 was the fact that political parties have deployed serial callers who are foot soldiers on radio, and even those radio hosts and managers who are interested in making sure the right things are done. The challenge is we cannot anticipate what people are going to say before they say it. And there was a guy at Angel FM in Kumasi who said, oh, director, and he said it in tree. Yewo akwabia say na yetimi ehu ne voice nti wofra na yakate no. But otherwise, ofra first no a. Nia oya ne say, oh, ofra no gyina so. Oh, President Mahama Mumpa de. Oh, minua Mahama de ukasa wo dwen no ho a. Ah, amampani we de. Wajimi pa o. And then he hangs up. And you cannot anticipate what the person is going to say, you know. And so when you have an environment like that, is really quite a challenging one, particularly in COVID, where a lot of work will be done via radio. I remember the last recent NDC, they call it what? Moment of truth or something. They actually published close to 100 radio stations that, you know, the event was going to be aired live on. And that gives an indication of what perhaps they plan to do as a political party going forward. And of course, the presidential candidate had started this Facebook Live thing. The other critical issue in terms of the media's role in the electoral process is the question of capacity. And whether or not, even if the media we have, some of them are really committed to professionalism, whether they have the capacity to be able to handle the gamut of information that is put out there, and whether they have the capacity to be able to do the fact-checking that is required, resource-wise, human capacity-wise. And I think that is also a major challenge because there's a significant deficit in terms of capacity among not just journalists, but also managers in terms of how they handle such situations. Now, the ownership is one thing, but then there is also the question of who is financing the media. Who are the financiers of the media? And across Africa, close to 80% of the budget to the media is from government. So through government advertising, advertising by ministries, department, agencies, procurement notices, and so on and so forth. And there is significant evidence to suggest that everywhere in Africa, or most countries in Africa, during elections, would try to manipulate this as a way of controlling the media. So you play ball, or financially you are squeezed. And even here in Ghana, I think that if you talk to the various media organizations, you get a sense of what is happening. It is not just under a particular regime. In all regimes it happens, And in fact, it's not just about government's budget that is controlled directly by government agencies, ministries, and departments. It also transcends into the private sector. And who you finance as a corporate entity, as far as media is concerned, will determine how government relates with you. And it's not surprising that during particular regimes, you will see certain big companies being the sponsors of major programs on certain platforms. And once that government leaves power, they move from sponsoring those particular programs that are either pro-government or anti-government. Then, in our context, I think there is also a big issue about regulation. And I'm sure George, being a lawyer and the position that he holds, would be the best person to speak about that. But we live in a country that we can say we have a media space that is largely unregulated. So there is no broadcasting law. The NCA, of course, supervises over, have supervision over who gets frequency and who doesn't get frequency. Now remember, in 2017, we had a meeting with some people at the NTA, and the feedback we got was, oh, frequencies are all gone, you know, and somebody said, it's all gone. And the impression I got at that time was that there were no even frequencies to be allocated. But we can see that new media houses are coming up, you know. That should tell us, you know, how things are going in terms of the regulatory space. And the Media Foundation for West Africa, the GJA was involved, the Ghana Community Radio Network. There was a campaign that was started, I think before the 2016 election, on transparency of the airways in terms of who are the owners of the frequencies. Because we did a study on media ownership monitoring in Ghana. We paid to get the records at the Registrar General's Department. But apart from the few well-known ones, like Kwesi Chum and the Multimedia Group, Despite and the Despite Group of Media, and then at that time, Hoda, you know, the Dufour Group, which were quite obvious. The rest of the media houses, you get a company name at Registrar General, but you never get to know who that person or who the owners of the company are. And so in terms of ownership, in terms of transparency of the airwaves, is a major issue. And I think that that, again, is something that if we had a broadcasting legislation, for example, perhaps we could have addressed. The NMC is a wonderful institution. I think the framers of our constitution did a great job at the time that the NMC was being set up. Because coming from a dictatorship and culture of silence and so on and so forth, the framers of our constitution, I think, were so bold in saying that we must have a commission that is independent, that will not be subject to the control and direction of, you know, any authority and so on and so forth. And then, of course, denied it the power to sanction. So, for example, in Benin or in Cote d'Ivoire, the regulatory body can simply withdraw the license of a media organization and say, for the next 3 months, you are not broadcasting because of this particular infraction. Here, the National Media Commission would not be in a position, or is not in a position to be able to do that, even if there are glaring infractions, such as what some of the media organizations do during electioneering periods, for example. Yes, they can summon, listen to the different sides, ask erring sides to apologize or publish a rejoinder, and there have been occasions where even the media organization that is headed by a member of the commission refuses to comply with the decision of the commission and actually writes an editorial to condemn the commission that at the time she was a member of. You know, so this is the kind of situation that we find ourselves in terms of the regulatory environment, and as somebody would say, maybe the impotence with which we can deal with some of the media houses that will be erring. I know in 2016, the NMC, the NCA came together and said, look, if there was a situation requiring that we take down a frequency, we would not hesitate to do that. But the challenge is, we have an NCA that is directly under the executive. So for example, the radio station in Sugakope, Tong Radio, we know recently the NCA, indicated that their frequency had been withdrawn for whatever they were doing in relation to this Western Togoland agenda, which is something that nobody should play with. Because I think a lot of the fundamentalist groups in the region starts like that. We want to separate, we want to secede from this country, and so on and so forth. So if you have a radio station that appears to give a platform for members of this group to come and justify why it's important that they break away from Ghana and so on and so forth, I don't think it's a matter that we should play with. And therefore, ordinarily, if the frequency of such a station is taken down, it's understandable. But you read the reasons that the NCA gives for taking down the frequency, and it's because they broadcast a certain type of content. And then the question comes in, is the NCA the institution mandated to, regulate what is allowed or not allowed on air? And the answer is no. And in fact, the NCA Act itself says they must at all times act in consultation with the NMC. But here was the case that there was no evidence that the NMC was involved, the body that is supposed to determine whether content is appropriate or not. So if we say, well, the NCA is the body that gives frequency, and therefore we should also empower them to be able to say, oh, Wuntumi Radio in Kumasi is doing something that is dangerous, and therefore we've taken the frequency. The question is, would they act when a station that is pro-government is involved, or would they act only when a station that is anti-government or pro-opposition is involved? So the regulatory environment is something that is quite murky, and I'm sure, as I said, George may be able to speak to that in details. Now, I had already mentioned the issues about the digital penetration that Kwame wonderfully presented. But here this is where perhaps the big issue is going to be. For example, if you go online now, you will find Joy Newsroom. And we all know Joy FM. And the attempt is to confuse people between My Joy Online, which is one of maybe the most visited as Kwame projected, and to have Joy Newsroom. And you go to Joy Newsroom and all you find is pro-MPP content. There is also graphic.com, which is different from graphic.com.gh, which is the official online portal of the Daily Graphic that we know. And as Kwame projected, it is also one of the most visited websites in Ghana. Again, if you go to graphic.com, the colors and everything they use is the same as the colors, the font, and everything they use is the same as what graphic.com.gh, which is the official website, is using. Of course, we know that there is a BBC FM station in Ghana. And so you would find bbcnewsghana.com. And you go there, and the colors and the font and everything looks like the official BBC website. And these should tell us, the plans and so on that people are hatching in terms of how they would manipulate the system in our country. Now, a research was put out by University of Exeter and I think 2 other universities who jointly conducted the research on social media and politics in Ghana. And this was put out in November. And in there, it is stated that, well, in 2016, there was a massive competition in terms of social media and how the 2 main political parties were actually slugging it out. And eventually, the MPP dominated. And the research points to the fact that, based on that, the opposition now, which was then in government, is massively also recruiting what it called social media armies. And in fact, as at that time, November 2019, the MPP, based on the research, had recruited over 700 young men and women to engage on social media. And in fact, I have friends on both sides who confirm this. And so those of us who, Dr. Akwete and others who are activists, if you are massive or your presence online is quite active, you would really encounter a lot of abuses. You know, and I encounter it every day, and I think I've made up my mind that, well, it's become a normal thing because the idea is to bully you out or to bully you to follow them. And I've friends on both sides who tell me, oh, they'll call me, Charlie, today you appear on our platform. What that means is that a screenshot is taken, shared on the platform, and the idea is attack or diffuse or try to whittle it down, say it's not true, you know, try to delegitimize the content and so on and so forth. And I think that it is going to get worse by the day, especially with COVID, and now that it's become so clear that the digital platform is perhaps where the elections will be won. I think the political parties are going to do a lot and a lot more. And this, for me, brings in the question whether or not we should regulate. And as Doc sent me questions yesterday, there are indications from several Ghanaians that we need to regulate the space, we need to regulate the environment, and so on and so forth. Now, as Kwame pointed out, I think that regulation can be quite tricky, because in the earlier submission by Dr. Akwete, during elections, all rights come to play. The right to assembly, right to free speech, right to general expression, and so on and so forth. The question is, in many places where legislation has been used by a certain government, the objective has always been to see how it can counter a certain effect on the chances of the government. And so today, if we were to advocate that, oh, between now and the elections period, let's have a regulation or something to regulate the internet space and how it can be used, or let's have a broadcasting law quickly, you know, to deal with the broadcast sector. Let's have other pieces of legislation to deal with what can be said, what cannot be said. The suspicion, even if it turns out to be legitimate, there would be genuine suspicion that, well, the government wants to do that, or the government wants to do this, and so on and so forth. And I think that under the circumstances, legislation or regulation at this time may not be the route that we would want to pursue. I think best practices have always been to look at 3 things and see whether they would work. And if they don't, of course, that is not to say that regulation at all times must stay aside. There are other elements that may require regulation. The first point is whether we can prevent what is happening. Are there preventive measures that we can adopt? And I think with that, what comes to mind is what Kwame mentioned, media literacy. If the population is highly literate and they can know that, no, this is Joy Newsroom, it is not the same as my Joy Online. No, this is graphic.com. The website for Daily Graphic is graphic.com.gh. So no, I can't be deceived. No, this WhatsApp message I'm receiving, no. Where is it coming from? Oh, this person said it came from a friend, and that friend said it came from a friend, and the friend is not named. This is likely something that is fake, and so on and so forth. At least we can minimize the impact of the deception or the misinformation or the fake news that would happen. The other point is to identify and monitor, which is something that we have been trying to do in the last 2 previous elections, and we are doing now, which is to try and do the fact-checking, let the public know this is true, this is not true, this is false, this is misleading, and so on and so. But it's such a massive thing that requires a lot of resources in terms of both human resource and financial resource. So you can only do as much. And of course, the naming and shaming thing that we do in terms of letting the politicians know, Kwame, you said this on this, and it's quite abusive. Sometimes people call us and say, well, I didn't even know that my name had been mentioned until my daughter came home and said they heard my name or this, and I don't remember saying anything on any radio, you know. And then we look at it and say, oh, but you were on this platform on this day. Yeah, I remember I was there, but I never said anything that you would say is abusive. Okay, usually I would say, let me check and get back to you. And getting back to the person would mean sending the person the direct quotation of what they said. And when you send it, okay, this one. But you see, my brother, you are not being fair. this other person who was on the studio with me also said something similar. And in fact, I was only reacting. So why didn't you also cite the person? So eventually, people become cautious of what they say. And there are others who are like, dead goat. No matter what you do, they would want to do what they would do. Unfortunately, people have done that and earned themselves positions in both parties. So it has become something that is almost attractive. That, oh, if this person was so abusive and at the end of the day has been appointed as PRO of this state agency or appointed deputy minister or chief executive of this entity, I would want to also get recognized. And the way of getting recognized is to be abusive, to attack, and be quite vociferous on the various platforms. The other thing is the containment, which the various social media platforms are now trying to do. Trying to deploy technology that can shut down bots and automated messages. Fortunately, here in Ghana, research has shown that there is a human being behind every account. What we don't know is between maybe the last 3 months till elections period, if we would not have bots and automated, accounts that would push a lot of fake news and so on. But as at the end of last year, the research indicated that there is a human being behind every account. Even if you see that no image or no face is behind it and it's something, there is somebody who is operating it. So hopefully if it goes on that way, then the tracking becomes relatively not as complex as, we would find it. And then, of course, the last bit is the regulatory part, where, as I said, we need to be very, very careful in terms of how we deploy regulation without stifling people's right to express themselves freely, because elections and democracy is about a contest of ideas, which means that people have to be vociferous, people have to speak their minds, and so on and so forth. And therefore, we have to draw the line between what is hate speech, what is acceptable, what is just an expression of an opinion. So that if someone says, I think what you're saying is, it doesn't make sense. Or, what you are saying amounts to something that is foolish. People don't say, he says I'm foolish, or he's attacking me, and so on and so forth. And of course, such legislation must also at all times meet the best international and regional human rights legal standards, which is always a difficult thing to adhere to when countries decide that they want to make laws to regulate the environment. But I think apart from the issues of absence of a broadcasting law and other pieces of legislation, we are in a country where issues of opinion polls, what happens? Are media allowed to publish anything? Issues of access to political parties in terms of equity and equality. Apart from the state-owned media, where there is a legal standard and a judicial decision that all parties must be given equal access. In terms of the private space, if the NBC happens to own 2/3 of the media organizations in the country, then it means access to these platforms would remain something that they have control over. So how do we ensure that during elections in particular, there is access to the media space by all actors? And Kwame talked about the inequality that sometimes limits access by some groups of people to social media and the opportunities to engage using digital platforms. So regulatory ways of limiting the space, I'm not sure. For this particular election, maybe we have to think about it in the long term. But as I said, there are other elements that we would need to look at in terms of regulation, access, accessibility, equity, equality, and so on and so forth. But in terms of recommendations, I think I fully endorse all the recommendations that Kwame put out there. And perhaps we need to ramp up our fact-checking and monitoring capabilities. Even if you are not a media organization, I think fact-checking is something that is not about media expertise. I'm sure IDEC, for example, can do a wonderful job in that space, even if it decides to focus on issues around campaign promises, or we promise this or we promise that. Is it real? Is it true? maybe IDEC and other institutions may even be better placed to monitor and fact-check such claims better than some of us who are not into real governance work. And of course, the bit about media literacy for our population is also something that is so critical. I think I'll end here, and I'm sure as the questions come in, we would be able to touch on other issues.
Thank you very much, Sulemana. Shall we do it again for him? Yeah. So, I am going to call our next speaker, Mr. Joseph. But before he comes to the podium, I think it is important to remind each and every one of us that this webinar is taking place by kind courtesy of support from the Royal Dutch Embassy based here in Accra, and we are extremely grateful to them for providing this support.
Just a reminder that the program is also live on YouTube, and you can tweet about it on our Facebook and Twitter pages, IDEC Ghana. Thank you.
Thank you very, very much. I come into this house with great humility and excitement, and I'm always extremely happy when I meet Mr. Jonah, who has become such an important friend. He was my senior tutor in Legon Hall. There's a story that if I get the permission of the person involved, I will tell publicly one day. But I just quickly want to say that to celebrate your sense of justice and fairness as I have known it. When Mr. Jonah was senior house tutor, that was when accommodation was becoming a problem on Legon campus. And then he decided that for purposes of equity, anytime there was a decision to be made, he would look at the cases of people who were coming from very far away from Accra before he looked at everybody else. It was not particularly popular with a lot of the Accra students, but I recall the particular case that he himself may have forgotten. I'm following him as he walks into Legon Hall. Somebody actually had a trunk and a chop box coming from, very far away. He asked the guy, what do you want? He says he doesn't have a room. He asked the guy to follow us. Followed him upstairs. Say, you don't know that that person became a member of parliament. You know. I'm very happy that you remember this incident. So thank you very much, and I'm always happy to be here. But I also want to issue a very quick disclaimer. My brother Sule talked about dead goat. I want to dissociate myself from it. Yes. The next thing that I want us to take seriously, if you would notice, two things came out very clearly in the presentations by our two experts, Kwame and Sule. Kwame examined the, let us call it the non-spectrum-based media, the entire online ecosystem that technically would be what we call the virtual world, very thoroughly. In doing that, he explained to us the challenge of regulation. Even as he speaks, you could notice that Kwame on one hand calls for regulation, and then in the next breath pulls a brake. But we've got to be careful. Sule does the same thing. He bemoans the lack of regulatory framework, then concludes by cautioning about regulation again. That is the conundrum that faces the society. It is not the technical complications. It is not the legal complications. It is the society's complete ambivalence towards addressing questions of regulations that create the problem. It is not the legal or technical difficulties. We regulate by community standards, okay? And until the community is able to reach some consensus about exactly what defines our society, it is always a complex and almost an impossible task to do media regulations. So let me just give you two quick examples. Take, say, pornography or indecency. How do you deal with that? In some societies, they define it very physically. So it is the degree of exposure of the human body. Okay. In some societies, they define it psychologically. So material that excites prurient interest without any educational value. So when Kwame talks about sex education and matters like that in relation to pornography, for societies that address these issues from a psychological point of view, sex education wouldn't pose a problem for them. For those who address it physically, let me give you just a typical example. If you were defining pornography by physical characteristics using the degree of exposure of the human body, how would you, for example, treat a depot dancer on television? You understand? So if you want to use Ghanaian standards, what is that Ghanaian standard? And that is why the degree of exposure that would be permitted on television in Egypt won't be the same as what the Americans will permit. So some of the people that you see on television in America, if you put them anywhere in Saudi Arabia, they could be whipped. You understand, for indecency. So that is the complications involved in dealing with regulations. It is not that it is not possible. It is just that there is ambivalence within the society towards regulation. So when you hear top-class experts like Kwame and Sule speak, they bemoan it, but in the next breath, they are cautious about it. And so this is where the challenge is. For us at the National Media Commission, we started thinking about these issues more than 10 years ago. In 2006, as part of, at the personal level, I was part of a small group of then young people who came up with the reflections that we designed architecture for peace that led to the creation of the National Peace Council. In doing that work, we discovered that media was going to be extremely critical in the nation's democratic experiment, and particularly for protecting peace. And what were the things that forced us, particularly both traditional and the digital world? A number of things had happened around the world. One was that by that time, we had had a number of big international wars in Sudan, Chad, Syria, Iraq, those areas. And in all these wars, there were elements of disinformation that had become a problem. But because the digital world had not massified at the level that we have it today, a lot of people were not looking at it. We were then looking at it. There were also a number of natural disasters that had spared a number of, attitudes that today you would also describe as disinformation. And I'm sure that the researchers will recall some of the critical issues around the Lake Chad water basin area, Cameroon, Niger, Chad, and all those areas, and the degree of disinformation that emerged, particularly within the NGO sector in America, about people who were using or were claimed to be using pictures from Africa for purposes of soliciting for funding that were not true, and issues like that. In the technology world, a number of things were emerging. One was the idea that we were beginning to have non-spectrum-based applications for content delivery. The first was the introduction of IPTV, Internet Protocol Television, and radio. And it's important that you understand those to be different from streaming. When we talk about IPTV, we are dealing with something completely different. It's not like, say, TV3 or GTV doing terrestrial production and streaming it online. This is a technology that enables the totality of the production of TV to happen online. The reason why, from a regulatory point of view, this is critical is that until recently, and through our generations, we have regulated broadcasting through the regulation of the spectrum. So we assign you the spectrum, and then based on that license, you are given conditions to fulfill. And if you didn't fulfill those conditions, the license was withdrawn or you were sanctioned based on that. So content standards were tied to spectrum. For the first time around this period, we are beginning to see applications that are not based on spectrum and therefore are unregulated. Just at the same time, the world was moving into digital migration. For those of you who have followed television and migration policies a bit more, you would discover that it completely changes the value chain in TV broadcasting. In television, we have always had one entity that produces content and then transmits that content from their production site to your home. So that entity is the TV station. In digital migration, particularly in the African context, we break the value chain between transmission and content production. So in Ghana, as we have now, we are setting up one company that everybody is going to transmit through. And then all the TV stations, as you know, then become content producers who produce their content and transmit on that platform. So the biggest challenge was, which of them now becomes the the TV station? Is it the content producer or the multiplex holder? And where do you place liability? If there is offensive content, who do you hold liable? Is it the person producing the content? Is it the multiplex owner? You may follow traditional jurisprudence to say, okay, why don't you hold both of them liable? If we are going to hold them liable together, does the multiplex holder then have the right to say, because if you brought content that is offensive, because I'm going to be held jointly liable, can I exclude that offensive content? What then would happen if it did to the constitutional prohibitions against censorship? You understand? So these were the complications that were emerging in the technology side. Again, at the level of the ITU was contemplating a policy called unified licensing, which meant that if you were given a license to use a spectrum, whatever your spectrum could do, you could use it for. So take the current telephone companies that you know. In the past, when we talked of a telephone company, they could only carry messages from one point to the other. Today, more and more innovations are moving from the edges of the network into the network itself. So the network does more than just carrying simple messages from one point to the other. A lot of them are very simple approach and said, listen, the technology is going to complicate itself as we move ahead. Therefore, we don't need to worry ourselves about the nature, type, character, and form of the technology. What is needed is that regardless of the type of technology you are using, the content you deliver must satisfy certain basic standards. So the Commission, over a long period of almost 10 years, order to be able to operate in America. So a similar provision that exists in every provision in any broadcasting law in the world, our Supreme Court says that is unconstitutional. So when you have, and this reflects the general ambivalence that you have around regulatory issues. So if you want to understand the court's own attitude, for example, take series of cases, like regardless of under which rubrics of the law it came, to the extent that they emanate from speech and broadcasting issues. So you will take this case that I've just given to you, compare that with the case of the Muntie 3, which were decided just around the same time. May he so rest in peace, Sir John. Take the Sir John contempt case. There are two bigger cases, the Kenkranchi cases. And you would notice that even at the level of the judiciary, there's a certain degree of ambivalence about how do we address this complex issue of balancing the right to free expression and ensuring responsibility and safeguarding society. And that is precisely where we are. So the problems we are dealing with essentially are not as complicated as we sometimes let it look. What is complicated is about how to build, and Dr. Akwete likes this expression that until he and his colleagues moved to East Legon, I was always wondering, but now that he's in East Legon, I can understand what it means. Elite consensus. Yes, and I knew that my brother was always elite, but would finally be exposed by what the Lord has done to IDEG. But that is the truth. The only way society can move on complex issues of politics, of society, and the relationship that should exist between media and society and culture
We know from regulatory philosophy that this is too loud. Can you help? It's too loud. Okay. Hello? Hello? Anyway, let me struggle with it and see how it goes. In media regulation or in any other regulation, we say that there are two kinds of people, okay? 80% of people in every regulatory industry only need clear rules, and they would voluntarily comply. In every situation, more than 80% of the people only require clear rules, and they would ordinarily comply without anybody having to enforce anything against them. I can bet that most of you who are here, if you see a no parking lot, you just don't park there. Sometimes it's not because you fear that somebody would arrest you. There are circumstances that it's clear in your mind that nobody would be there to inspect, but you just wouldn't park there. Once your conscience tells you that it is wrong to throw rubbish on the street, so many of us here won't do it, simply because your own conscience is your key regulator. People tend to breach rules when the rules either do not exist or lack clarity. So if you were able to set very clear rules about how everybody should engage, I could bet you that these things won't be that complicated. The next thing that I want to do is to just quickly get into what can unravel in the next elections. We have talked about two concepts that are critical in addressing the political space, whether virtual or real. One is, how do we secure independence for the media? And two, how do we secure their responsibility? And that is precisely what the Constitution of Ghana requires under Chapter 12 of the Constitution. So regarding independence, what are the threats? Across the world, we have seen internet shutdowns. Kwame talked about them. And shutdowns occur in different forms. They may shut down the entire network. They may shut down some service. We have seen countries where they allow voice communication but wouldn't allow WhatsApp, for example, wouldn't allow any video application. We have seen situations where they shut down just SMS. We have actually, in one of the situations in Cameroon, their most important attack was on mobile money. And you know why? Because the political forces saw that the opposition was sending money to people using mobile money to vote for them, just as the government was carrying physical cash because they had military protection. The opposition couldn't move much, so they had to rely on mobile money. The government shut down the mobile money service. Okay, so that can happen. We saw in the case of Chad that the government actually commandeered two networks. The government took over the networks, and to use that for government communication in a moment when people were mobilizing for protest. So that can also happen. Fortunately for us in Ghana, we have never had any such situation. Kwame could explain a bit more to the team about something we call throttling in the industry, which is just simply a process by which you reduce the speed of the content transmission. And it's one of the most effective ways by which nobody can actually see what you have done. The flip side is that on election day, communication becomes so critical. Sometimes, generally, networks get jammed. And if you are in a nation that is suspicious of each other, even when there is a legitimate situation of some kind of slowing down in the network, people can assume that it's politically motivated. Then the other way we have seen happen around the world in seeking to control social media especially is what our colleagues have talked about regarding laws. Again, in our country, we have not seen any of these happen. So, going into election 2020, my fears regarding these are fairly limited. And one of the reasons why I don't have that fear is that Sule talked about the NCA and he and civil society's frustration with the NCA. I would have loved that NCA were here to explain how they work. I had the responsibility of serving on the NCA board for about 6 years. So I tend to have a little understanding of how the institution functions. What I can assure most of us here and people listening to us is that NCA in most cases is not interested in the politics that we associate with them. The second thing that I want to explain, and it's just for purposes of explanation, about the Sule's frustration with the fact that they told them in 2017 there were no frequencies, and then all of a sudden they see new radio stations. Again, Sule, technology-wise, that is true. Kwame would understand that digital technology is improving so fast that it is not, but I always use a very crude analogy. Anybody who has used the analog watch before and a digital watch, you notice that sometimes when you set your watch, you are unable to tell exactly whether you have put it on 217 or it is 218. Isn't that correct? But if you are using a digital watch and you wanted to set it at 218, you just point it at 218 and it is there. It is the same thing with the analog radio. You want to tune to a frequency, sometimes you are struggling, but if it's a digital radio, you want 99.7, you just punch it and it is there. It is the same thing that happens in the management of the frequency. So you want to assign 99.7, you want to give another person, let us say 99.9, but because they are so close, they will interfere as people try to get into the network. So the more the technology, so what has been the traditional approach is that when you assign a frequency, you leave a guard band before you get to the next frequency. You may have a national policy that says we are keeping a guard band of say 3 or 4 megahertz. If that happens, it means that if you assign 99.2 and you are leaving 5, you can only go to 99.7. But as the technology of transmission improves, sometimes you are able to close the gap. What I suspect is happening is that they have developed technology that enable them to reduce the gaps, and therefore they are freeing more spectrum for assignment. This is purely from a technical point of view, what I suspect could be happening. And I say that not to take away the civil society coalition's concerns about the fact that the institution could engage more. But I'm only using that to illustrate the point that if we found time to engage more, perhaps some of the suspicions that we have around these regulatory issues may go down. So let me just close my discussions by saying there are a number of things that I think we can do in order to safeguard the environment. Because of the constraints of time, one that the Commission did in the last election that worked, that we hope to do again, is, if Sule would recall, you spoke at a function that I moderated at the British Council exactly on this topic in the last elections, about whether or not we were going to keep the virtual space open for purposes of engagement. This was in direct response to media claims, which the IGP at the time denied though, that the police were planning to shut down the internet if it became necessary. So we had a discussion, we built a coalition around it, and the job of the coalition was first and foremost to secure commitment from everybody that there was not going to be any such thing. We got the commitment from the president at the time, we got the commitment from the National Communications Authority, we got the commitment from the police, and with the backing of civil society. Fortunately, we did not see that. As I have said, I have not seen anything either within the technological space or the movement around the regulators that anybody is planning this. Keep in mind also that our telcos have become extremely powerful, and therefore they also see elections as a major business opportunity that they would not allow themselves to be manipulated to lose. And so let's keep that as well in mind. Within that frame, I just want to help us to understand that when we conceptualize these issues, we should include business so that we can understand that the state itself is there, civil society is there, but a democratized market also creates avenues for businesses also to develop their strength, to be able to engage the political system in moments like this. And I want to make my last comment on the broadcasting law. Sule expresses some anxiety over anybody hurriedly passing a law now, and I completely share that kind of feeling. That if we are going to use the legislative approach, we would need, again, coming back to DOC, consensus on this. We can't do anything within this democratic space by avoiding that. And it does not appear that we have adequate time, as Sule argued, to be able to do that. And therefore, the non-regulatory interventions that they have indicated also somehow appeal to me. But in their appealing to me, I still want to sound a certain degree of caution. If you took fact-checking, for example, those of us from peace and conflict background know that during elections, the speed of communication triggering conflict does not match with the speed of fact-checking and its influence and impact on the society. So we need to keep that in mind in our reflections. And I believe that with God on our side and all of us working together, we are going to have another successful elections, and the Lord is going to give us the opportunity to beat the COVID so that in the end we may have another opportunity like this to reflect over how the elections went and if there were any lessons we learned. Thank you very much for the opportunity. Pardon.
Applause for him. Now, distinguished ladies and gentlemen, we have listened very attentively to our three top experts, and increasingly the impression I am getting is that even if we wanted to regulate the virtual media, it is not going to be very easy. That conclusion is very, very clear. It's not something that you can do in the short term. It is something that you can think about in the medium to long term, because the complications are very many. So I am going to open the floor to questions, contributions, comments. But before I do that, when I was in secondary school, I learned about a very big word called malapropism. You want to pronounce one word and you end up pronouncing the other. I have done that this morning. When I was doing the acknowledgement, I committed one very serious malapropism. I wanted to pronounce one word, I ended up pronouncing the other. So I want to repeat the acknowledgement that this webinar is happening by kind courtesy of support from the Royal Danish Embassy in Accra. And we are extremely grateful for their support. It is not just this webinar, but other ones that will subsequently take place will be conducted with support from this embassy. So we are very, very grateful to the Royal Danish Embassy based in Accra here. So I think the first time I made this announcement, I pronounced the name differently. Thank you. Now, so this is how it is going to happen. The questions, the comments are open, not to just to those of us in the room here, but to people listening to us from wherever they are. I am sure that people will have very, very useful contribution to make to this very interesting and informative discussion. So, I will now open the floor to discussions. You just raise your hand and mention your name. Yeah.
Ladies and gentlemen, I would like to remind you that we're reaching you live on Microsoft Teams webinar. And while you're actually session, our online participants are kindly advised to click on the Raise Your Hand button to ask questions or to make your submissions. And alternatively, you can also write or type out your questions in the meeting chat column, and our able resource persons, I'm sure, will gladly respond to your submissions. Thank you very much, and the floor is open.
For how long should the direction section take? Okay. Dr. Kochi, can you kindly come to the podium?
And probably this goes to all the three participants because we are talking about regulation. I'm wondering, Suleimana talked about education, literacy, as one of the ways of dealing with the issues. If people understood what transpires on the virtual, digital, and other media we have, they will be able to, compliance will come from that literacy and will be more effective. But I also heard Kwame in his presentation saying that comparing China with how they control, and also looking at the situation in Ghana, which is relatively more difficult to control. And so there is no other way. You have two extremes, control and you don't control. And then I heard the regulator. I call George the regulator. Some people think regulators are devices, so they get confused when I call you regulator. Yeah, it's and he's telling us about the real challenge. He kept using the word ambivalence, but also the democratic rights and how you interpret it and so on. And yet, this small country of ours has close to 400 FM radio stations, many of them with online, and now we're seeing a whole lot of news streaming and all that, and absolutely no control. And the dilemma of, is it pornography or not? I mean, is it should we continue to have more radio stations because it's a democratic space for expressing democratic freedom? Is that where the problem is? Could it be what we need to look at carefully? Why have we allowed it to expand so rapidly at a time that technology itself is also changing rapidly from what Kwame told us? Have we created a Frankenstein monster and we cannot restrain, we cannot control it, so now we are finding reasons to say, well, let's pray about it, let's live with it. Is it not a rational thing? What can we do? Because the threats are real. You see, the threats are real. And I think probably technology is moving things so fast. And in the election realm, it is going to be extremely difficult when it was also explained to us by Sele, the individual partisan ownership of things, and the primary goal is power and so on. How does that differ from also another problem we are facing, like monetization and so on? So it leaves us a bit powerless as citizens who also have rights to ensure that our peace and stability, our safety are not threatened by hungry, people who want power and business. And as you rightly said, telcos are also, private sector are also increasingly seeing elections as business and is also reacting. So at the end of the day, the citizen is increasingly looking disempowered. And I think that is a threat to our democracy because it's becoming monocracy and influence and technology and money are now playing out. Is that the system we wanted? Is there a middle way? How do you create that? If all three of you could address that.
Because this particular question is coming from my boss, I would like for us to deal with it immediately. But subsequently, we will take about 2-3 questions before we call the panelists to address, because this is very, very important.
So we have some questions in the chat box. The first one is to the National Media Commission. Can the commission set up under the Freedom of Information Law start with supervising the social media space during elections? The second question is, this is an era of no rallies, but from what we have seen of the NPP primaries and the NDC vice president announcement, these are more like rallies, with COVID-19 regulations broken, no less by our leaders. How will these experts advise political leaders to use technology to restrict these bad examples we are seeing? The first question was from Caroline Boateng, and the second one is from Angela Domna Abuaji.
Good. So, honorable panelists, who goes first? Kwame, I think you.
Please, you can turn on your microphones and speak.
Yeah.
Am I okay?
Yes.
The list of questioners scare me. Angela, Caroline, I'm not sure I have any responses to that. I must be very honest. The part about NMC under the Freedom of Information Act is not immediately clear to me conceptually how we would do that. If the commission would do anything, we are likely to do it under our own constitutional authority and our legislation than under that. So that's about that. My next attempt would be Dr. Queta's question about the numbers, the type of ownership, its implications for democracy and the citizens' safety and the sense of disempowerment. My view is slightly different. From a regulatory point of view, the numbers don't pose any problem. Again, from a regulatory point of view, the type of ownership poses no problem. What is problematic is the same ambivalence that I have talked about, and why. If there is consensus about how we should manage public discourse. If there is consensus within our politics that the avenues of public discourse cannot be littered with filth and indecency in our search for a decent society, then you can regulate based on that. In that case, it wouldn't matter whether a radio station is owned by old Nick the Devil himself. If he has to follow the rules, he follows the rules. If he doesn't follow the rules, he suffers the consequences set out. So I wouldn't be worried about who owns the media. It doesn't mean that that ownership thing is not important for regulatory purposes. What I want to say is that we don't need that to ensure standards. But the political ownership of radio stations speaks to another bigger problem about the political economy of the media. In other words, the big question about who qualifies to own the means of, or the access to the means of public communication. It is a fundamental question that we have to address. But we don't necessarily need to address that in order to address the question of standards. They belong to two categories of problems. Finally, the question of the numbers, it speaks more to the market than the standards. The only relationship between that and the standards is that we can easily argue from a professional media point of view is that if the market is small and everybody needs a bite at it, then they can be forced into unprofessional practice in order to survive. But that is only because there are no rules. If the rules existed and everybody had to play by the rules, then those who couldn't survive within the rules will naturally go out of business. So if you don't have the rules, then that kind of confusion can arise. And we don't have the rules only because as a society, we have considerable nervousness about how to set the right balance between the right to free expression and the legitimate need to protect public order in a democratic society. That is the way I see it.
Yeah. Mr. Lewan, you want to have a bite?
I hope, yes. So, to Doc's question about the numbers, I think George has touched on it. Anywhere I have spoken outside of Ghana, when people hear of the size of the population and the number of radio stations that we have, the immediate question is, why? What is happening? And so on. Now, I think that if media houses were being set up for purposes of journalism, certainly the economy we have cannot support the number of outlets that we have. And indeed, that is reflected in the fact that there are maybe more than 70% of the radio stations that are operating. The people who operate there, their salaries and monthly bills and everything are directly paid by the owner, not out of resources, if any, generated by the media outlet. Indeed, there are several media organizations that are basically not generating anything because no advertising, no commercials, and so on and so forth. There are a few that will rely on we, the NGOs, you travel there, you have a project, so you pay them for airtime and so on and so forth. But that certainly cannot even pay for the renting of a transmitter space or whatever that they have. So I think, first of all, is the fact that these are being established not for purposes of journalism, but for purposes of political career advancement, for winning power, and so on and so forth. And to that extent, people don't care about whether they make money out of the business or not. And that then certainly compromises the quality of the standards, because it's about not journalism, it's about political propaganda and so on and so forth. And the effect of that ultimately is that people lose trust and confidence in the media. And so increasingly you would realize that people don't, when you talk about safety of journalists and the media has to be free and so on, the public reaction doesn't, demonstrate one of support towards the media, because it's either they are saying, oh, journalists are now corrupt, oh, media, what are we getting from media, and so on and so forth. And it's all because people have set them up for different ideas other than the whole thing about journalism. And I think that if it continues this way, it's, as Doc said, it leaves a lot of the citizens quite vulnerable, because it's about who has money and who has the opportunity to get a frequency to set up a media organization. I think what is required really is that 20-year-old effort to get a broadcasting law in the country. And people will tell you, when the initiative started, it was the same broadcasters that frustrated it, because there were provisions about how many radio stations can an individual own. And we know, for example, that there are now conglomerates, you know, individual or individuals owning multiple stations in Accra, others in Takoradi, others in Kumasi, and so on and so forth.
But in all the regions.
Yes, and that level of you know, ownership and influence would have been curtailed by a broadcasting law. Currently, I think multimedia is in court with the NCA also about the directive to limit the
Capacity,
the transmission, you know, to a 40 kilometers radius. And the question is, oh, but we've been broadcasting all these years. We have listeners who live in places far beyond 40 kilometers. All of a sudden, if this were to be implemented, it cuts them off, and so on and so forth. And I think it's all because we don't have a regulatory framework for the broadcast sector. Of course, George talked about digital platform for broadcasting now. Of course, people continue to rely more and more on the traditional broadcast space. And I think that the broadcasting law would have dealt with this matter. And that is something that we would need urgently in this country.
Come in, you want to come in?
Yeah, so to add to that, I want to agree with all the panelists. But more importantly, we need to understand that chaos or lack of order is very expensive. So we cannot be at that point that we will not have some order in the space. Thankfully, since we don't have a broadcast law and all that, it's a good time to harmonize some form of regulation that can look across board all the various channels of media that we have in place. Largely, we need to realize that public discourse and discussion is important, and George stressed that. But more importantly, we need to set general principles that say that, look, on this social media, this is the do's and don'ts at the basic level, at the broad level. And that I don't mean a new law or a new policy per se. And that can help drive some discussion around that. Then we can arrive at a point that we can institutionalize this or codify it into a law or policy. If we don't take time and effort to sort out this issue, it's going to grow. And the talk about 400 radio stations, nothing. We can have about 1 million websites or online platform or blogs or video channels that you have to look at. So I think for me it's critical that we start having this discussion, this public dialogue, but we need to have in mind that we need to do something about it. And for me, it's to set out that general principles at the very broad level to start with. That will allow us to have a dialogue, a discussion around it, to arrive at a certain solution, which would be conducive for, if not all, majority in the space that we live in as a country.
Good. Thank you. Did they touch on Caroline's question?
Yes.
And Angela's question?
For Angela's question, it was about how would these experts advise political leaders to use technology to restrict these bad examples that we saw during the NPP primaries in terms of adhering to social distancing protocols?
Okay.
So I think I mentioned that in my presentation that the political parties or the artists need to develop their capacity. For some reason, we are assuming that tomorrow they can walk up to some maybe studio or somewhere and just do an online rally. They need the capacity, they need the know-how, and we need to figure a way out of supporting them. So it's a role that civil society can play and other artists can play. The more importantly also, they need to find out from their base who are resourceful in this area. So they are utilizing the resources in-house. Because some of those guys, when they have resources coming from outside, they don't want to look at them. So inside the political parties, I believe there are enough resources. So how do they harness that to support their efforts? But it always comes to the principle of our mindset. We know a deputy minister who had this condition and went out to see what? The polling station. Well, the belief is that you need to go out there. You need to do that face-to-face interaction. And if you don't do that, you may lose power or you may not gain power. So how do we change that mindset, that attitude, the culture, the practice towards the fact that, look, And now it's possible they can also win power using what? What that means apart from the age-old practice of face-to-face. And I think that's a fundamental issue that we need to resolve in terms of how we socialize or culturalize the political artists about the fact that there's a new hot game in town and you have to make sure that you invest in it.
Thank you.
Yeah. Suleiman wants to come in.
So the question of how can we advise the political leaders to desist or to use technology to move away from what we saw during the MPP primaries and during the announcement of the vice presidential candidate of the NDC, I think the reality is that we need to say things as they are in terms of our political context. Kwane's suggestion about the use of technology is fantastic, is brilliant. But we live in a society where on the day of election, whether we're talking about general elections, so you have all parties contesting among each other, or you are talking about intra-party elections, you have instances where on the day of election, a contestant is complaining about voter list that has been swapped and the album has been changed and somebody's name has been moved and people are busing people from here to come here and vote and so on and so forth. So our electoral system, the way it is, you know, the candidates and the parties themselves know that as it is now, there are things that happen, you know, in order to win, or if you don't do this, you are likely to lose. And that is why, for me, adoption of technology fully is going to be quite problematic, because that would be, we trust that, look, the system is fair. Whoever the candidates will vote for, let them vote for, and so on and so forth. But people will tell you, look, yes, the pink sheets, we know about the pink sheets, but at the end of the day, you know, 100 becomes 1,000 and 10 becomes 100 and all those kinds of things, which technology may not aid you to do, because for technology, you put in and it will count it for you absolutely. So until the time that our politics becomes so clean, and it is about the popular will of the masses that determines who the winner is, other than who manages to get their supporters into the electoral album or the polling station album and so on and so forth, I think the leaders are going to be quite hesitant in adopting technology fully for either elections or decision making at the local level or at the national level.
Good, thank you.
Technically, that Angela should weigh the issues again. Our politics is Gauta Ganama. We mobilize you, you come, we pay you. You understand? So unless you are adding mobile money to that angle, when network issues can also delay payments and payments will not come, that is the question of monetization that we talked about. If mobilization is cash-driven, is a commercial mercenary enterprise, then people would require that kind of gathering to provide direct human service and demand direct remuneration there and then. So it's going to be a very complex issue at the cynical level, but at the practical level, experiences from Florida to the midterm elections in the US teach us that even in areas where technology adoption is high, in highly emotive moments like elections, you want to go slow with technology. But it does not mean we should abandon the search. What it means is that we should begin now to begin to interrogate these processes. Which of the processes are less contested that we can rely on technology? What technology? What is the cost of technology? What is the cost of adoption? What safeguards can we build into those technologies? It appears to me that if we begin the conversation now, it may be long, but as Osibisa said, we shall get there. You understand? The road may be rough, but we will get there.
But heaven knows.
Yes,
well, heaven knows.
I'm very careful, you know.
Okay, Dustina, what the next round of questions?
Yes, so the next question is, what is keeping the broadcasting law from being passed apart from the fear of the potential of regulating speech, are we not complicating matters the longer we wait? The second question is that ambivalence cultural, Mr. Sarkom? What do we do to get to the point of consensus for an abuse-free political environment on all channels? And the last question is, which institution will lead the charge for coordinating the quest for technological politicking? The National Media Commission? Is it up to the task?
So the first one is on the broadcasting law. Why? What has delayed it?
From commenting on the broadcasting law for fear of isolating my base, which is the professional civil society involved in the broadcasting law. But when you put me on the spot like this, then you put me in a very serious position. On one hand, as an audience member of this meeting, I owe you honest intellectual response. On the other hand, I also fear to lose my base. I will elect to serve you rather than take a political decision. There are a number of reasons why that law is not what we need, and this is why. 20 years ago, when we started advocating for a broadcasting law, let me explain first that broadcasting law contains two elements. There are technical standards and content standards, okay? When we started, there was nothing. And so we put together a law that set both technical standards and the content standards for broadcasting. Subsequent to our effort, we passed the Electronic Communications Act, which set better and higher quality technical standard for broadcasting. So it completely removed the technical component of the broadcasting law. That is dealt with under the Electronic Communications Act. What is left to address is the content side. That speaks to what I tried to explain to you earlier about our attempt to deal with the content standards in electronic communication, which would have dealt with both online virtual communication and electronic communication of the broadcasting type. The reason why in our context that is the way to go is that globally, there are two systems of regulations. We have converged regulations and non-converged regulations. In countries where you have converged regulation, both the technical standards and the content standards are regulated by the same converged regulator. An example is Ofcom in the UK or FCC in the US. There are many other countries where content is regulated by one entity, technical standards are regulated by another. Those are non-converged institutions. In non-converged regulatory environments, you pass non-converged pieces of legislation. What we were seeking to do in the broadcasting law was to pass a converged piece of legislation on a non-converged regulatory environment. There's no example anywhere in the world. So if you had the law today, operationalizing that law, the challenge of operationalizing that law will create more complications than its non-existence. And that is why, from a pure professional point of view, as somebody who has worked on broadcasting legislation across the world for at least 10 years, for somebody teaching broadcasting law and policy, I do not think that is the way to go. This is the first time I've had the courage to speak out like this. I know if you don't see me from the next couple of days, it could be any of many reasons, including my own allies dealing with me. But the reality is that two things I have said. From global best practice, we are seeking to pass a converged piece of legislation on a non-converged regulatory environment. That does not exist anywhere. It is going to be complicated. Two is that precisely because we have a non-converged regulatory environment, the state has passed the legislation that deals with the technical standards of broadcasting in the Electronic Communications Act. What is left to be done is the content standards. However, there is one political reason why if they abandon the broadcasting law is going to be complicated. That is the point Sule made. Neither the Electronic Communications Act as it exists now, nor the content standards that we sought to pass
addressed that big political economic question of who controls access to the means of public communication and how to secure equity in that. So if there was a way by which you could address this big question, it would appear to me that we need two sets of legislations. But if we are unable to do that, then we need to find a way, in my view, to address that equity question. It is not a question that we can abandon if we want to sustain our democracy. It appears to me that most of our colleagues in the advocacy for the law are held back heavily by this important value, because it is something that we need to pursue. So because that is in the law, and neither route will give us that safeguard, that is what keeps, in my view, most of the people holding to the broadcasting legislation in the form in which it is. But professionally speaking, as a regulator, I don't think that is the way to go. We need to address the issue based on the policy orientation of the state as a non-converged regulatory environment, but within that space, we need to find a way to address the question of equity in the allocation of broadcasting resources. Thank you.
Good. Dasina, any more?
So the next question was to Mr. Sarpong. Is that ambivalence cultural? What do we do to get to the point of consensus for an abuse-free political environment on all channels?
For the philosophers and political scientists, the two of them. But if you force me to make a small statement, I would say there are two statements in the past 10 years that I have not found an alternative for in my discussion of governance in Ghana. One is Dr. Kwete's statement that I just quoted, that we need to reach some kind of elite consensus. The only reason why I don't like the elite is that it excludes me. But I like the consensus part. But I think that is the way to go. The other statement that I always quote, actually three of them, is from Professor Odrigajeko, who says one cannot have more than enough training in the media. And it seems to me it's such an important point when I talk about media standards. But just to conclude, I will say we have enough space to move the dialogue forward. We need to be open about where we go from here. Sule brought this big, because you said the dead goat, let me bring the elephant. There's a big elephant in the room when we discuss broadcasting legislation. Those who already control spectral resources in the industry don't want to lose. And as a result, they would find every reason to raise concerns about the legislation. Those who don't have private interests but strongly believe that the society is better served by creating the space for equity are also not going to abandon that. And I think if they did abandon that, the society will suffer. So as far as I'm concerned, the only item left in terms of concept that we don't know how to address is this question of equity that everybody is running around. And I think we need to put it on the table and reach consensus on that. When we reach consensus on what is the best way to go, it appears to me that we should do what our regulatory environment demands. We are a non-converged regulatory environment. We ought to have a non-converged piece of legislation to regulate the environment. Thank you.
Listen, any other?
So we have another question, which says that which institution will lead the charge for coordinating the quest for technological politicking? The National Media Commission, is it up to the task? And a last comment. Then, to serve the ends of justice, we need to change our COVID regulations to recognize political realities. Otherwise, the laws cannot be enforced.
Why we set the process in motion towards dealing with LI 222 for over a long 10-year period. I think that the Commission is the best place to do this because it's a multi-stakeholder forum where all the critical stakeholders in the media industry are adequately represented. There's a quick run. You would recall that
the Journalists Association, the Independent Broadcasters Association, the Private Newspaper Publishers Association, Parliament, civil society, women's groups, the Bar Association, the Christian community, the Muslim community. Almost everybody is represented at NNC. And therefore, I still believe that that multi-stakeholder forum may be the best forum to have this kind of dialogue.
Anything, yeah, Sile.
Well, I think that is good, and George is here, and sometimes it may be good to put him on the spot. I think a lot of the challenges we are having within the media ecosystem would be dealt with by no other institution other than the National Media Commission. And as I said earlier, I think the Commission is one of the critical institutions that the Constitution framed in such a way that when we talk about, you know, working independently without the control and direction by any entity, you see it reflected there. And as George just said, if you look at the composition and the institutions that are supposed to come together to have the NMC constituted, it's such an amazing institution. However, we all do know that over the years, resource has been a major challenge. And I know maybe George may be constrained in putting out maybe how poor they are, advertising their institutional poverty here. But certainly that is one of the major challenges that the Commission, we know it has. The other thing is that if you go to other countries, Cote d'Ivoire, Benin, in fact, in Benin, for example, the chairman of the National Media Commission, the counterpart there, is the fourth most powerful person in the country, to the extent that the person, when they are moving, rides in the motorcade and so on and so forth. I remember Nana Kwesi Jana Pinten always says that there was this ACRAN, the African Communications Regulators Network, that he was chairing when he was chair of the Media Commission. So there was a convening in Benin. And at the Togo side, Benin-Togo border, you know, there was a whole convoy, motorcade, you know, to take him to Cotonou. And they were surprised that, is that how you just came? Because here, the president of HACA is the fourth most powerful person in the country. If you go to Cote d'Ivoire, it's almost about the same. And in fact, in these countries, commissioners are not just, you know, commissioners part-time, they do their own things. And as I said before, a member who is running a newspaper refuses to comply with the decision of the commission, for example. In those countries, commissioners are paid commissioners, just like the Electoral Commission or the Commission for Human Rights. So if somebody is a commissioner of the Media Commission, that's supposed to be a full-time job that they do. But here we have a commission, an 18-member, if I'm right, so headed by an executive secretary, a deputy, a small secretariat, staff. I don't know how many staff, George, you have, but the rest that we call commissioners are people doing their independent work, you know, either a newspaper editor, a publisher, somebody representing the Muslim coalition has their own job, so, and then parliamentarians, 2 from majority side, 1 from minority side. So in terms of the work that the commission can even do, it's quite limited. And I don't think that we can continue to have the commission function the way it has always functioned. You know, where are the powers? Where are the human and material resources for the commission to work? For example, in these other countries, you have the commission well set up to be able to monitor. I know, for example, at some point there was an EU support to help the Media Commission to be able to monitor what goes on within the airwaves and so on and so forth. But does the commission have the capacity to be able to do that? And I think these are the matters that must be brought to the front burner. Whether it is policy frameworks that must be, the commission has a broadcasting, local language broadcast standards. You know, are they able to monitor what is happening? So I think that maybe George, we need to always bring that to the front burner. In terms of the capacity deficit, the poverty of the commission, and the fact that an executive secretary and a deputy cannot be tasked to do the day-to-day job of monitoring over 400 radio stations, 60 television stations, internet and digital issues coming up, and so on and so forth. So, knowing the challenges we are having within the media space, I think we can. At the time the NMC was set up in 1993, it was just GBC. Just GBC. And yet, we found the need to set up a commission like that. And then subsequently, 94, Joy FM came up, Radio Universe, and then subsequently Peace FM, and so on and so forth. So a commission that was set up at the time that we had just one broadcaster, later 2, 3, 4. Now there are 400 broadcasters. And yet we do have a commission that is made up of non-full-time commissioners, executive secretary, deputy, and maybe a few staff members. In fact, George, this is not to further advertise your whatever. I think not too long ago, they were almost evicted from their current premises because, another institution says we gave it to them on basis of rent and not that you were to occupy it without paying rent. And I don't know whether, George, you have been able to pay your rent, because I heard it somewhere, or maybe it's not true. Before then, they were occupying just some small space. An institution that is supposed to be regulating a sector that is so crucial for our democratic development. It cannot be. And I think that, George, maybe you are, I don't know, maybe I'm saying it this way and the situation is different, but I think the NMC needs to be empowered, legally, resource-wise, personnel-wise, and perhaps it is time we convert to have commissioners that are full-time commissioners, like the EC commissioners, whose day-to-day job would be thinking how we deal with the media sector and make sure that we have an environment that is fit for purpose, an environment that is serving our democratic expectations and ideals. Otherwise, commission that was set up for, at a time when we had 2, 3 media houses, now 400, 660 or more television stations, I don't think it is workable. No internet, or if there was internet at all, no blogs, no websites, and today, thousands of them. But George, maybe you may want to respond if...
Just to quickly add, I believe that the Media Commission can provide that leadership, but you mentioned the capacity. So especially we are looking at a space which is changing in terms of the new media, things to do with social media, the messaging platforms and all that. So if the National Media Commission is going to provide that leadership, then it should be conditioned on those capacities and those ability and the resources to tackle this. Because I believe that if we don't look at the holistic approach, although George was saying that we are in the non-convenient environment.
Convergence.
Yes, we still have to look at how we can align both the traditional and non-traditional in a manner that will ensure that at the end of the day, we are not coming back and say, look, maybe we face traditional media, but there's still things to do with new media that we have not invested or paid attention to.
Good. George, do you want to come back? I think they are doing very serious advocacy work for you. Okay. Okay.
Please, before you wrap up,
Yeah.
could we sum this up and say that, look, you were set up 28 years ago or 27, so that clearly you made it that the problem
The
has to be looked at from the perspective of the Media Commission. Things have evolved, a huge sector, technology-driven and all that. And the regulator is still, so it's time to review and see how they empower. And that's the source of the problem. I think that for me is clear. Yes.
Yeah, okay. Well, I think I was going to make closing remarks. I think Dr. Kwete has made those closing remarks already. Now, once again, I want to remind everybody who is listening to us that this webinar has made possible by kind courtesy of support from the Royal Danish Embassy, and we are extremely grateful to them for the support. But we have had a very, very nice time. What it has increasingly become very, very clear is that there are serious capacity problems as far as the job of regulation is concerned. First of all, the NMC, which was supposed to do this regulation, was established at a time when the landscape was very, very different. Only GBC existed. Second, Kwame has made it abundantly clear that even this regulation was not designed for social media. So we have serious capacity problems, financial capacity, personnel capacity problems. And that is where I agree with Dr. Emmanuel Kwete that the time has come for us to take another look at the regulatory environment. What can we do to strengthen the capacity of the NMC to regulate? And I think this is not something that is going to happen in the next few months or days. It is something that we have to look at within the medium to long term framework. And so I think this is an important conclusion to draw from today's webinar, that what is hindering serious regulation is the capacity problem. And we can close this webinar, all of us reflecting on how best to build the capacity of the NMC in order to deal with the problems of regulation. On this note, Dosina? Yes, I will call upon, is it Patrick Okine, to come and give the vote of thanks, especially to our resource persons. Or you want Dosina to do it? Okay, Dosina, please. No. Yes, vote of thanks, please. Especially to our distinguished resource persons and the listeners as well.
Thank you very much for tuning into the IDEX webinar on the 2020 elections, our first webinar. We would like to thank, firstly, the Royal Danish Embassy for supporting this webinar. We'd also We would also like to thank our distinguished panelists for coming to share their expertise and teaching us so much about using the virtual space for the 2020 elections. So firstly, I would like to thank Mr. George Sarpon, the Executive Secretary of the National Media Commission. Thank you very much for coming. Secondly, I would like to thank Mr. Suleiman Abrahima from the Media Foundation for West Africa, the Executive Director. Thank you so much for coming today. I would also like to thank Mr. Kwame Ahiabenu II, who is also the founder of Pen Plus Bytes. Thank you so much for coming. And to our dear Mr. Jonah for moderating this event. Thank you so much. And for the Executive Director, Dr. Akwete, for participating. Thank you so much for coming. And to all the representatives from the media houses, thank you so much for participating in our event, and we hope that you'd be able to share it to a wider audience. Thank you so much. And for the IDEX staff, thank you for putting everything together, and we hope that you have a very nice day. So before we close, we would just like to give an announcement that there are refreshments out there for those who joined us today. So kindly go outside and respect the social distancing protocols that have been put in place. Thank you and have a nice day.
Thank you. Don't behave like the political parties. There is a lot. There's a lot in this regulation area.
Media persons should please remain seated. They will be ushered out by Mr. Okine.
There's so much. Educated. No. Okay. You will go to our boardroom, the three of you. To interview these people. These are the knowledgeable people. Yeah. Okay. 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 Sule, please, you go to the boardroom for refreshment. George, you're back to the boardroom for refreshment. George. Yeah, okay. Okay, you can start with them because I'm here. Talk to the knowledgeable, talk to the experts, the knowledgeable people who.
I thought all the experts, but I was